If you just bought the brand new Fujifilm X100VI or the Fujifilm X100V, and this is your first camera ever, or if you're coming from a different camera system like I was, like Canon, Sony, or Nikon, and you have literally no idea what you're doing on this Fuji camera, then this is the video for you. In this video, we're gonna go over every single button on this camera and exactly what the buttons do out of the box, as well as some specific settings that you wanna change in both the photo and the video mode to get you the best possible image quality right out of the gate. Let's start with the exterior of the body and familiarizing ourselves with all of the buttons. On top, we have the on and off switch, which you can flick in either direction to either turn the camera on or off. On top of the switch, we have the shutter button, which by default can be half pressed to focus and full press to take an image or start recording. To the right of this, we have our exposure wheel. So this tells your camera to either overexpose or underexpose our image by a certain range. So the plus amounts being overexposure and the minus amounts being underexposure. And this really applies whenever we're using automatic modes, which we'll get to in a second. The master wheel controls shutter speed. So the numbers are 1 over the number you see. So for example, if we go to 60, this would be 1 over 60th of a second for the shutter speed. There are also T and B modes, which are for bulb or time speeds. And there's also an A, which you can see over here in red, which stands for automatic mode for shutter speed. Moving on, if we lift this dial, we can actually now move the dial underneath, which I thought was so cool the first time I ever did it. And this controls your ISO. So these are your various ISO values. And there's also a value in here for C, which controls your custom ISO modes, as well as A, which controls your automatic ISO mode. Now let's move on to the front of the camera. On the left, you have a scroll wheel that can also be pressed. Both of these settings do nothing out of the box and can be mapped to a custom setting. Then you have another button that by default lets you adjust what your control ring does, which we'll get to in a second. On the same button, we have a flicker. So if you flick this and hold it to the right, it does absolutely nothing by default. But if you flick it and you hold it to the left, this is what activates the built-in force stop and defilter, which is super useful for video and for long exposure daytime photography. Then we have our aperture ring, which lets you select your aperture, and the A at the end is for auto. Now you can also turn the control ring, and by default it crops into your image to mimic other focal lengths, but it is doing this digitally and you can do this yourself manually in post, which is what I personally recommend doing. On the side of the camera, we have our focus selector. The M is for manual focus. The C is for continuous focus and what you should use for moving objects and what I personally leave it on. And the S is for single focus, usually used for stationary objects. Now on the back of the camera, which is what you'll be staring at most of the time, you have a scroll wheel on the right, which by default controls your shutter speed and can also be pressed into a custom function. Then you have the AEL and AFL button. This logs both your exposure and your focus. Next to this, you have your drive button, and this lets you basically select what mode your camera is in. So you can switch between various photo modes, and this is also how you access the video mode. On the side, you also have this small Q button. This lets you access some settings that you might want to change quickly without diving into the menu, and these can be customized. Next up, we have the joystick. This is how you navigate menus and move around your focus points. It can also be pressed in to make selections. We'll skip the menu button for now, but below that, we have the play button. This lets you access the photos and videos that you have taken to view them in playback. And finally, we have the display and back button. This button can be used to back out of menus, and when in a shooting mode, you can adjust what information is displayed on your screen. This also acts as your Bluetooth pairing button if you want to pair to the Fuji app. And finally, we have the menu button, and this obviously opens up your menus. Now, as promised, let's change some settings to optimize our camera for quality. Under the image quality settings section, you want to go to image size and you want to change your image size to large at 3:2. And this is going to give you the largest possible image that your camera is able to produce. Next up, we're going to move down into image quality, and you want to make sure that fine plus raw is selected. This will give you the highest quality JPEG as well as a raw file. So whether you're a professional photographer or a beginner, I highly recommend this, just so you have the raws for both archival reasons, and if you ever decide to become more of a professional photographer and really want to edit your raw photos. Next up, you want to set raw recording to uncompressed. You want the biggest and most detailed file size possible. Next up, between JPEG and HEIF, you want to select JPEG. This is the most universal format for most images. All of the other settings on this page pertain to recipes, which are like filters on your images. I'll make another video around recipes and which ones I use, but if you're in a rush, you can go to a website called Fuji Weekly, which has thousands of recipes, and it'll tell you exactly what settings to change to get a certain look. Under the autofocus settings, I would scroll down and onto the second page, and I would activate face and eye settings detections, and this basically just lets the camera track a face or any eyes if it ends up seeing those. I would also come down to the third page and select touchscreen mode and change this to autofocus. This will basically let you move your touch point on your screen around with your finger rather than just the joystick. All right, so that's it for our photo settings. Let's move on to our video settings. So you want to hit your drive button and you want to go all the way to the bottom to movie and select that. Now, if you go ahead and hit the menu button, you're going to notice that if you scroll all the way to the top, you're going to have more movie settings that you didn't have before. Now, you want to head into movie setting list. You want to open up the first menu and you want to select 6.2K, which is the highest resolution that this camera can record in, and 23.98 frames per second. Once you're done with that, you want to come down one more, and then for your SD card, which is what you're usually going to be recording out of, you want to select H.265.422. This will give you 10-bit color, and you want to select 200 megabytes per second, which will give you the highest bit rate for your video. Once you're done with that, scroll all the way to the bottom of the first page and select F-Log2 for both SD recording and HDMI recording. This will give you the flattest profile possible and the most dynamic range whenever you're recording video. And finally, once you're done with these, you want to head down to the wrench icon. You want to select screen setup, and then I would come down into the third page and change display custom settings, then select EVF/LCD, and you want to come in here and you want to turn on histogram. This is going to be turned off by default and is really helpful whenever you're taking photos, especially outside. It just lets you have a better idea of what information you're keeping and what information you're losing. So as you learn to read a histogram, this will become an essential tool in your photography kit. And the last thing I would change is on the second page of the same wrench icon. Screen settings is turning F-Log View Assist on. And this basically puts a conversion LUT on top of your flat F-Log profile. So whenever you're recording video, you're actually looking at a color corrected version of the video rather than a flatter image, so you have an idea what the end output is going to look like. And that's it. That's your beginner's guide on how to set up your Fujifilm X100VI or your Fujifilm X100V. And hopefully after watching this video, you understand what every single button on this camera does out of the box and what the purpose is, and hopefully you were able to change some of those settings to get the maximum image quality out of this camera. Now, I also recently just picked up the X100VI and I've been taking it everywhere with me, and I've been really enjoying using this camera, and it's really just making me fall in love with daily photography all over again rather than just shooting for clients or going on trips. But other than that, that's it. That's it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned something new, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one, and until then, keep creating.